Okay, cool. Thanks a lot. Looks like we've got about 60% QA and 36% in the dev realm, so that's good. That's maybe a little more developers than I expected, but hopefully we'll get you something out of it, especially towards the end. I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop here. Throughout my talk today, if you have a question, go ahead and just go ahead and type it in. I don't think we can unmute or talk, can we, Brianna? So if you got a question, just go ahead and type it in, and I'll try and keep my eye on that, and Brianna will interrupt as needed to. I kind of have a tendency to get on a roll and forget to check for questions and that sort of thing. Okay, well, thanks, Brianna. A couple things here. After I do these talks, I tend to get a lot of emails, so if you would feel free to write my email address down. It's tstar with 1 R at intertech.com. If there's any questions throughout the course of the presentation here that I can't answer, or for some reason you don't get a chance to ask a question, or you don't want to do it publicly, or whatever the reason, go ahead and fire me off an email. I do my best to get those types of questions answered within a day or two. Usually, if I know it off the top of my head, it's going to be 5 minutes or so. I also do a fair amount of blogging, and you can find my blog if you go to the intertech.com/blog, and you can do a search by authors. For Tim Starr, I'd say it's probably 70% are testing tool topics. I've been blogging for about the last 6 months just because I've been really busy, but I've got quite a few blogs in mind, and I hope to get 4, 5, 6 out here by the end of the year. I've got some old stuff out on timsbrownbagelunch.blogspot.com, some nice, I think, good code review material that I use and used when I was a development manager. And I just started tweeting, I think is how you say it. I just joined Twitter recently. If you want to follow me there, it's at startj04. It's pretty much, I'll send a tweet once or twice a week, and it's pretty much QA testing tool type tweets only. Okay, I think Brianna did a fine job of describing who I am, so I'm going to skip that. And my whole goal today here is to talk about all of the different test options with Visual Studio. And at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is, by educating you about the different test types, their strengths, their weaknesses, hopefully you guys will do a better job of choosing which testing is appropriate for your projects. So which test tools should I use for my projects? So I'm going to start off with manual testing with Microsoft Test Manager. I'm going to go into Coded UI after that. We're going to take a look at the web performance and load test. They kind of go hand in hand. We're going to take a short peek. I think we're going to go unit test, then order test, and generic test, and just briefly on the order test and generic tests. Okay, I don't want to go and speak to this slide. I'm going to include it in my deck so that you can download it. I get a lot of questions. What edition of Visual Studio is a certain tool available in? So this is really for your reference. If you want to download the slides after my talk, they should be out on intertech.com, in the next couple of days. Okay, so to get started, Microsoft Test Manager. That's Microsoft's testing tool targeting the manual tester. It's very strong for black box testing, and when I say black box testing, I mean that you don't have to have any understanding of the details of the code that you're executing. Okay, so there's code running somewhere, but you don't have to understand that this certain class is doing this and this certain class's job is to do that. So this is for black box testing. It's good when you want to run a test multiple times. It's good if you have multiple manual tests using a shared set of steps. Okay, so there's something called shared steps. It's good for verifying bug fixes. It's something new in Visual Studio 2012 and Microsoft Test Manager 2012, that is exploratory testing. I'm going to show you a little bit of that today. definitely warming up to that. It's pretty handy. It's certainly useful for complex validations. A lot of the rest of the talk is going to be around test automation, and you can't beat the human eye when you're looking at a web page or a complex application and you're trying to decide if it looks nice or if it's colored right or if it's aligned properly. It's certainly possible to do that with much of that anyways with automated tests, but it's really, really expensive. Okay, and it's also good for testing that requires physical interaction with devices, such as a power supply or something like that. So I think a lot of folks look at Test Manager and they think, oh, this is for, recording things on the screen and using that awesome fast forward feature, and I'm going to show you that. But I also want folks to keep in mind that if you've got a test where you have to, go turn on the power supply, do this, do that, and then the test passes or fails, maybe you measure something. It's also good for that. So what's it not good for? It's not good when you want to test and record applications with non-Microsoft UI components. In the next slide, I believe, is going to talk about what's supported, what's not. Obviously, it's not going to be good for testing and recording applications without a user interface. You can certainly do execute step by step, but the recording is not going to be useful with no user interface. And it's not ideal if you want full automation. See a question already. Brianna, I see Srinivas is having trouble with audio. All right, and again, I don't want to spend a ton of time speaking to this slide, so this is really included just for your reference. But when we're looking at, and this is the latest bits of Visual Studio, so this is specifically the 2012 bits, and supported operating systems are Windows 7, 8, Windows Server 2008. Notice that XP looks to be missing. .NET Frameworks 2.0 through 4.5. Let's see any highlights here. New HTML5 support, IE 9 and 10 here. And let's see, so IE 6 and 7 not supported. No support for, this is baked in support too, I should mention. Visual Studio is very extensible, so just because I'm saying it's not supported doesn't mean that there's not a third-party offering that supports some of this stuff. Okay, so if you grab those slides, you can go through that in more detail. And I've got the link down here on the bottom, as I'm sure this list is changing pretty frequently. I don't know if you guys follow Visual Studio as much as I do. It's kind of been announced that we can expect, I don't want to give exact dates, but we can expect frequent small releases of Visual Studio rather than sort of one big release every so many years. So I think we're going to see new feature functionality come out with some cadence, whether that's monthly or 3 months or quarterly. I'm not sure what it is, but I think that's kind of cool. Okay, so I'm not going to have a ton of slides here. The vast majority of what I'm doing is going to be in demos. Bear with me a little bit. As I mentioned, I'm using the new 2012 products. I only use them. I don't use them on site at my current employer, so I'm still getting acclimated, and I still struggle to find buttons here and there. So just kind of bear with me there. Just going to quickly keep an eye on the question here for a minute too. Okay, no, we're okay. All right, so Microsoft Test Manager. What I want to do is, so the mythical site I'm going to test today is Fabricom Fiber, and this is a site that Microsoft's put together, and it's used in a lot of hands-on labs, and it's available on Brian Harry's VM, for example. So I thought that would be a good application to use just because I suspect a lot of folks have at least kind of seen it before. And I'm going to focus on, I'm going to run through a couple of scenarios in Test Manager, then with Coded UI, then with Web Performance Test. So I'm going to do these same 3 scenarios. And the first one I'm going to do is, let's imagine that as a user of this site, I need to manage my employees. And specifically, I need to be able to manage my employee contact detail. So I'm going to go over to employees here. I'm going to edit an employee, and let's say that my service area has changed. So that's going to be one of the scenarios, just going in and editing an employee contact. The second thing I want to do here is I want to create a new ticket. So I'm a call center, if you will, and I'm working for a cable company, and a customer calls in and they've got a complaint, right? So I'm going to go through the scenario of creating a new ticket. All right, great. So that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on today. All right, so if I go into Microsoft Test Manager, and I've already got my plan set up and all that good stuff, so I'm kind of assuming you have at least some familiarity with Microsoft Test Manager. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to do something called exploratory testing. Okay, so within exploratory testing, I've got a couple of work items already. One of them is called create new ticket, and that's kind of the scenario that I walk through. And the story behind that is, as a customer support person, I need to be able to create a support ticket so I can capture the description of the problem and get somebody to the customer's house to fix the problem. Okay? Acceptance criteria is that I'm able to create the ticket, add the description, so on and so forth. All right, I've got a second product backlog item here, and this one is, as an employee, I need to be able to edit my contact information so that I can change my address or phone number. Okay, so those are the two scenarios that I'm going to be working on. So I'm going to go in and let's work the first one. I'm going to go in and I haven't set up a test case or anything. Pretend I haven't. I actually have, as I was staging data and that sort of thing. But assume that this product backlog item has just been set to complete. So as a QA person, I know that I can go in now and I can start taking a look at this feature. Okay, so I'm going to go select this feature. I'm going to say explore the work item. And since I've highlighted the work item, what it's going to do is it's going to capture the things I do. And if I hit save, it's going to associate all this work to that product backlog item. Okay, just also mention about my environment. I'm running on a pretty humongous laptop, but all of the TFS and the SQL Server and everything I'm testing is all on one machine here. And you add to that live meeting and things really slow down quite a bit. So don't look at this as indicative of performance if you're in a real production environment. And let's see, I've got a window off my screen and I can't hit the bar. A good time to mention, if I crash or lose audio in live meeting, I'll join just as quickly as I can. I've got a bad feeling. Good. Did have a full crash. Nope, this is the right one. Okay, so restart that. I'm going to go do my exploratory testing. Okay, looking better. So what comes up is this. Well, it's actually an exploratory testing window. It's kind of similar to the test runner window we'll see in a little bit. Notice it's warning me that both audio and video are recording. So just as I come across new features in 2012, I'm just going to give them a brief mention, but that's certainly not the focus. So the change here is that you can also record audio while you're doing your test. So I'm going to go and start my exploratory testing. Okay. Sorry about the speed there. I'll mention when I'm not in live meeting, this just flies. So, well, while I'm waiting for the screen to come alive, I'm going to just kind of mention a few things about this window. First thing here is if you want to view which product backlog item you're actually seeing, you can click on that. That's a link. It's not obvious. As you're testing, you can be typing your comments along in here and the action recordings being taken while you're going through your interactions. You can add screen grabs, which is kind of cool. Looks like we're back. So I'm going to start testing the application. So I'm going to launch Internet Explorer. I'm going to be just a little more patient before I kind of abandon trying to show you the exploratory testing. I think it's really cool enough. Wow. No, I'm hoping if I get it up, it's going to work fine, and then I'm going to, as quickly as possible, get out of exploratory testing, and hopefully the rest will show just fine. My desktop is basically frozen right now, so I can't even X out and abandon yet. You know, it's not even, wow, here it comes. Okay, so I'm going to launch the application. I'm going to navigate to the Fabricom Fiber site. This may actually be a Windows Explorer thing when I crashed, I'm not sure. Okay, so launch Explorer, navigate to my site. By the way, that's a bad practice. When you're doing navigation, type in the full URL. Don't use a shortcut like I did, because if you have multiple QA folks that need to execute this test and they don't have that exact same button on Internet Explorer, the recorded test is going to fail for them. So don't do that. Always just type in the full URL. So I'm going to go in, click on Employees. I'm going to edit the details. And if you remember, what I'm trying to do here is I want to be able to change my name, address, and phone number. Now notice over here that there's no field to put in a phone number, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a comment that phone number is not editable. And then I'm going to take a quick little screen grab here. I'm going to capture just a little rectangle area. That's going to pop in over here, so that's pretty cool. And then what I can actually do from here is I'm going to say, while I'm at it, I'm going to actually create a bug. Okay, so what Test Manager is going to do here is it's basically got a record of all the flailing and clicking around that I've done. And I can go in and I can edit this stuff if I want. I can delete some of these things. It's going to create a new bug here. Add the title, if I know who to assign it to, state, so on and so forth. It's got my screen grab. And then down here, here's what I think is so cool. Now, just given those recordings, I know that once this bug's going to is fixed, I need to be able to test it again. So I can save the bug, and I'm going to create a test case. So again, what Test Manager did here is it was keeping track of all the actions I was taking within the action recording, and it's going to create a new test case, and it's going to automatically put the actions that I did into the action over here so that I can test, so that I know what so I know what I was doing when I wrote up the bug. So that's going to save you a lot of time from having to type and that sort of thing. Now, just a quick note that the quality of these tips is dependent on the quality of the naming that the developers are doing. So they don't want to be putting button 1, button 2, button 3. Otherwise, the action recordings are going to be somewhat meaningless unless you're intimately aware of what the name of a given button is. So it'd be better to have a button OK and a button cancel or whatever your naming convention is. Okay, so this is my edit phone number test case. I'm going to save that and close that. And I'm going to get out of here. I am. My plan going forward, this is not Microsoft Test Manager. It's probably live meeting or maybe even something on my box. Okay, so the cool thing this has done for me now, if I go over to my plan contents and I look at the, what was I doing, edit the employee information, the test case I just automatically generated is automatically put into this requirements-based suite. So without me doing anything, really all I had to do was go in, identify which requirement I wanted to explore, click the Explore, do some clicking around the screen, and I was able to create a bug and a test case that I can reuse later So I think that's a nice, really slick workflow. So I've really warmed up to that. I was a little skeptical when I first saw the feature, but it's something that I'm really definitely warming up to. Okay, and then the second thing I want to do is I'm going to give this a whirl. So let's go. I'm going to go create a new test case. And let's see, this one was the, what did I say? Well, okay, create new ticket. And here is a little more traditional. So to kind of go through this workflow, you're going to have a good understanding of what the UI is going to look like coming down from the developers. So I know that let's see, what do? We launch Explorer. Let's navigate to, and I'm not going to write the whole URL here. Navigate to the website, click create. Let's see. Let's just call it enter. Now let's be more granular. Enter. What was it? Something like a title. Select escalation. Enter a description. Assign a customer. Assign it to the customer. Finally, click create. Then let's do go to dashboard. And then for my expected result, here's where I want to see the new ticket exists. Okay, so clearly there was a lot more typing on my part, certainly, to use this sort of workflow versus the exploratory testing. The second thing, and maybe even more important, is I had to get with the developer, figure out what they were kind of planning to do so that I could even go in and get started. And if they went off the path at all, this test case is going to be invalid. You're going to have to come in and edit it and all that sort of stuff. So not a huge deal, but I just think the whole exploratory testing workflow is a little bit better. So I'm going to save and close this. No, let's associate this with, let's link it to a product backlog item, which was soup, not bugs. Just one sec here. Oh man, just not quite used to the UI here. Oh, you know what's wrong. So let's see, test case 2, let's save it, close it. I'm going to go back to my create ticket, 660. There we go. I had the wrong association there. Okay. So now when we go to the test plan, if I look at my create new ticket, it didn't show up. So I even messed up the association there. Apologize for that. Okay, so now, now if I want to go run this thing, I'm going to go into my testing, run tests, my create new ticket. I'm going to say run. And again, if we see the same kind of performance issues we saw with exploratory testing, I'm going to bail out of this pretty quick. Okay, so this time I'm going to create an action recording. Okay, I'm going to just kind of abort all the test manager. So what I wanted to show you here was when you create an action recording, it's going to go through and record all of those actions within my steps. within my steps over here under the play. And then what you can do as you're executing this test case over and over again is you can actually go fast forward through all those steps. So that's pretty cool. Just in that if you've got 30 steps or something like that, or things that take a long time, and your validation is one of the last steps, you can just highlight the first 15 or whatever steps that you want, hit play, let the tool go through all the weighting and all that stuff for you, and then when it comes time to validate, you can just interact with the validation then. Yeah, I'm going to get out of here. I apologize for that. So, okay, in any case, that's kind of a typical manual testing workflow using Test Manager. Okay, that went well. The next thing I want to talk about now then is coded UI tests. And there's several different flavors of coded UI tests. I want to show you, time permitting, I want to show you about 3 of them. I used a lot more time on the Test Manager than I wanted to, but time permitting, I want to kind of show you 3 of the 5 or so that I'm going to talk about. So coded UI testing in general, regardless of the technique, when do you want to use it? Again, this is similar to Test Manager in that it's black box testing. You're testing the UI. You don't need to have intimate knowledge of what's going on at a code level to do a good job of testing and writing coded UI tests. You want to do this. It's expensive to do from a time standpoint. It's not easy. So you're going to want to do this when you want to run tests multiple times, obviously. And when you don't want to do this, again, this coded UI testing uses the same tools underneath as Test Manager, so it's got the same constraints as Test Manager as far as what sorts of applications you can test against. Obviously, it's not going to work for testing applications with user interface, and it's not at all good for load testing. And I've got an asterisk there because I want to mention it is possible to use coded UI tests as a part of a load test, but it's really impractical. The reason it's impractical is that a coded UI test has to interact with the desktop to be able to perform. So therefore, if you include this with a load test, you need an agent per virtual user that you're trying to load. So if you're trying to set up a load test with just 100 users, not many, a lot of applications, just 100 users, that means you need 100 virtual machines or physical machines running agents that are executing the coded UI test. So it's really impractical. Possible, but impractical. Okay, so the first kind of coded UI test is a single UI map. And this is kind of, if you do a lot of the walkthroughs and demos and you see sort of the 5 minutes, what's a coded UI test look like, this is what they're doing. These single UI maps are good for small teams. They're good for stable applications, and they're good for simpler apps. But I don't recommend using them very often, and the reason is this. It'll make a little more sense when I drop into Visual Studio and show you what a coded UI map looks like. The coded UI map will get really unwieldy if you've got a large application. I mean, thousands of lines of code. The second thing is, if you're using a single coded UI map and you're recording actions, you're going to have to check that file out from version control. And if you've got another teammate that's also trying to work on that same application, they're going to be trying to interact with that same UI map, and this UI map is generated, so it doesn't work. You'd both be doing multiple checkouts. You'd have to merge it. The UI map regenerates itself under various circumstances, so it's just not going to work. So really, the only time this works well, as I said, if you've got a small team, if you're a single QA working on a smaller app, it's going to be just fine, or maybe even a medium-sized app. The second thing is, if it's a relatively stable application, what I mean by that is if the user interface isn't changing a whole lot, you can make changes, move things around, nest them a little differently, that sort of thing. And a lot of times the UI map is still going to work. But if you're early in a project and you're changing the way the user interface looks drastically, you're wasting your time. The second option here is the coded UI test with multiple UI maps. I recommend using this far more often. It'll work for larger teams because now what you can do is divide the work up into pages or controls if you want to. QA person 1 is working on the create page, and QA person 2 might be working on the edit employee page, and that's going to be fine. You're not going to have a bunch of version control collisions because you're fighting for the same UI map resource. Same constraints though. If you're trying to write the coded UI test too early in the process and the UI is changing a lot, your tests are going to be breaking constantly. You're going to be spending a lot of time re-recording activities and that sort of thing. So again, it's favor this far more over the single UI map, but just beware, if the UI is changing a lot, you're probably jumping the gun a little bit trying to use this. Okay, the next type of coded UI testing is actually, this is a non-Microsoft solution out on CodePlex, and it's called Code First coded UI testing. This is only good for browser-based applications. It's going to be much better for less stable applications because the UI map has a pretty the standard coded UI search capabilities are pretty sophisticated. It'll be looking for anding and oring a bunch of properties together to do things that would speed up your search. But the code first approach, what this is doing is this is kind of doing, let me just make sure. Yeah, this is doing DOM-based searches. So basically every control you're interacting with is pretty much, you're going to search the entire DOM to interact with every control that you're using within your test. So that's moving things around is not a problem as long as your IDs or whatever are staying the same. Okay, so that's going to be a lot more resilient than your standard coded UI tests. This is going to work well for large apps and large teams. Probably not huge apps, because if the DOM is big, the searching for all those controls is just going to take too long. So okay for large apps, small apps, probably not for really complex, humongous applications. As I mentioned, it's browser-based only, so no WinForm, no WPF. There's no recording capabilities at all with this technique, so you're going to have to be a better coder. And as I mentioned already, this is going to execute more slowly. The final one I want to talk about is the coded UI test enhanced framework. Now, the thing about this one is that some teams internally at Microsoft use this. So that makes me feel better about, even suggesting folks look at a third-party framework. And the thing about this is, as of now, and I should mention, I've only seen demos of both the Qt and the coded UI Code First frameworks. I've worked on a Ranger project with folks that have used these, and we've had some discussions, so I feel qualified to mention them. But I don't want to mislead you in that, say that I've tried these and I do or do not like them. Okay, so again, my understanding here is this is browser-only apps. This will work well with large teams. This is pretty hardcore coding, so you're going to need some really strong coding skills if you're going to be writing these types of tests. And they do some pretty fancy searching here as well to improve the performance. So this is appropriate for very complicated applications. This is kind of because of, and again, when you get into these complicated searching algorithms, that's where you start to lose the resiliency. That's where you start to not search the entire DOM. So this is going to suffer if the UI is unstable as well, meaning you're going to be breaking your tests often. Okay, and this is also out on Codeplex, qt.codeplex.com. Okay, so now I'm really praying we don't suffer from the same performance problems we saw with Test Manager here. So what I want to do is go in and I've gone through all this in detail several times, so I'm not going to try and rewrite everything. So what I've got is a solution here, and basically in my solution I've got some business objects and a whole bunch of different tests. And let's just go, and I'm going to add a new test project, and I'm going to make it a coded UI test project, and I'm going to try and quickly show you the first 3 coded UI test methods here. So name my project, and because I told it I wanted to do some coded UI testing, what did I do? Did I add a new project? Yeah. Okay. It's going to come up and it prompts me, and it's going to say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to record actions or edit the UI map, or do you want to use an existing action recording? So what I want to do here is I'm going to use an existing action recording. So if my test manager demo would have went better, we would have seen after I did my create ticket that I had saved an action recording. Well, when I went through this in the last few days, I do have one. So I'm going to use one of those action recordings. I'm going to come up and it's going to query and say which one do you want to create it from. And I know that ID 665 has an action recording. So I'm going to click OK. Leave the mouse alone. You're going to see the IE is going to launch and some good stuff's going to happen, hopefully relatively quickly. Not relatively quickly. Oh, silly me. Okay, so here's what it did. It actually did complete relatively quickly. It just doesn't automatically execute it the first time. Okay, so if we go and we take a peek at what code was generated for me, it's created a coded UI test method for me. It used the action recording. Basically, it removes all the spaces within what's recorded in the action recording, and it creates a method for each of your different actions. So basically, I'm launching the browser, I'm clicking on a link and typing a title and so on and so forth. Rather than me reading this for you, let's just go ahead and execute this. See what it did for me. Okay, so again, this is within Test Manager. I created an action recording while I was executing a test, and now I've used Visual Studio to use that action recording and generate a fully functional, and I'm going to put in quote marks if you could see me, test. And the problem with this is that we are interacting a bunch with the application, so we've kind of run through stuff, and just because we didn't get an exception, I guess we can conclude that the test passed, but we haven't actually done any sort of assertion, right? We haven't tested anything at all. And so in my next demonstration, we'll take a look at that. So that's kind of the automatically generating code. It gives you a decent starting spot, but again, no matter what you do, it's only going to use the single UI map. So I use that creating a coded UI test from an action recording only for demonstration. I would only ever use this if I'm a team of one QA testing a relatively simple application. All right, the next thing I want to do, and those folks exist. I'm not knocking you. So now I'm going to create a new coded UI test. Only this time, I'm going to record all of my actions. So I keep my record option here, and you'll notice that the screen kind of minimizes, and down, hopefully without scrolling, in your lower right-hand side of your screen, I've got the coded UI test builder. So this is basically a recorder. Okay, so if I'm going to build up a test case here, I'm going to say start recording. No, and you know what, Tom, email me that exact question, and I'm going to point you to a document out on Codeplex. And I'm really concerned here that this coded UI test builder is it's using a similar engine as Test Manager, so I'm really concerned that I'm going to have the same performance problem. Tom, you email me, and I'm going to point you to a document that will help you troubleshoot that. Long story short, there's some settings in the qtagent32.config file where you can turn things like whether or not to capture the hovering. You can turn that on and off. And also, I don't even know if I'm getting a screen refresh, if I'm recording or not. So I'm going to just give this a try here. I don't think I am. Wow. No, I'm having the same problem. Let me see what I can do here. It's a great argument for having a Camtasia recording as a fallback, isn't it? I'm going to just try this a little differently. Last try here. I think it's recording. And I spelled that wrong. Okay, so when you mess up, go start over. I'm totally going to break the rules. I don't want to wait for Internet Explorer to launch again and record that. So this isn't going to really work, but I have a working version. So internet.fabriconfiber.com. Okay, so here's what a workflow with this looks like. So now I can go in. I'm going to go in. I'm going to do my create new ticket. And I generate code very frequently. And I use really verbose names. And hopefully when it goes to the test writing portion, writing the actual lines of code, you'll understand why. So I'm going to call this create ticket. No, I'm not. I'm going to call it click create ticket button. Okay. Now I'm going to add a title here. Generate code. Oh, forgot to record. Get rid of that. Record. Add a title. Generate. Record. Change the escalation level. Just got to record. Okay, messed up. No big deal. All I really need to do is get back to the page in the same state that it was, and I can resume recording. record, generate code. Select my customer. And then create, and didn't record. Now this is interesting. And this is another weakness of the single UI map. Remember, I already created a method called, what did I call it? Click create button. So if I try and use that same method name, it's going to overwrite the last one. Okay, so using a single UI map, it's going to be, you're going to want to kind of qualify your methods, maybe with some page information, because you're going to have OK buttons or cancel buttons all over the place, right? So maybe what I could have done would have called it click dashboard create button, click ticket create button, whatever, something like that. So this is another caution if you're using a single UI map, and for me it's another motivation to getting away from using single UI maps and using multiple UI maps. Everything's not in one junk drawer, so to speak. So I've got to call this something unique. New ticket create button, right? And generate. Finally, I'm going to go in. I'm going to go record back to the list. This is because of my scripting yesterday, and I don't want to replace it. And then finally, what I want to do, clicking through that, that's great, that exercises the app, but now what I really need to do is I need to be able to validate something, right? So down here on the little coded UI tests builder down here, this little target looking thing, if you click and hold your left mouse button down and drag it over the browser here, it's going to select little areas for me or things I want to validate. So I'm going to keep it really simple here, and I'm just going to validate that a title is in the grid. So I'm going to add what's called an assertion, and it's going to come up and say, what do you want to do? I want to validate that this cell is equal, you can see the R equal, to this text, a title. And a best practice would be to be putting all of these message on failures and that sort of thing. So this failure would be the title does not exist, for example. Now, if I run a test and I run this assertion and it fails, I'm going to get an intelligent message that says something like the title, whatever, does not exist. Okay, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to do that in the demonstration. Okay, and then the final thing I want to do is, let's see, did I generate that? Nope. Assert that it exists. I'm going to add and generate. And then the final thing you're going to want to do is actually record closing the browser. Okay, so I'm going to say record. Close the browser. Add and generate it. Say OK. And then when I close this, all that code has been generated for me. And here's why I'm really verbose in what I name these methods. Because especially when you're working in the single UI map, you're going to get the more, every control you have is basically in this UI map. Okay, so when you go use the IntelliSense, So if I say UI map dot, look at all this stuff I've got to get through. It needs to be named really well for me to understand what the heck it is I'm trying to interact with. Look at, I've got to click back to list link, click create button, click create new button, new link, new to, it's already unwieldy, and I've just added a handful of controls really to the application. Okay, so be thoughtful about what you name these methods. All right, I know I'm not going to demonstrate this running because I know it's not going to run. The recording of the launch of the browser wasn't captured. Let me see if I have, I think I do. I think I have a, oops. There we go. So I did basically the same thing over here. Let's just run this, see what it looks like. Unless I mess something up today, this should work just fine. Okay, and we passed, so cool. Now a couple of things to note. When I did my validation, again, I'm not worried too much about best practice. I just want to get the concepts across here. When I did my validation, a better validation would be something like validate that the last row in this grid has the correct whatever reference number and corresponding title, because the validation probably would have worked even if I went in and say deleted this item or something like that, because there were two of them there. So what I just demonstrated isn't a very robust, terribly useful example, and you do have to get in and do a little bit better coding with validations if you want it to be a really strong test. Unless, and I believe this is a good idea, if you're always starting from the same point. So let's imagine I've got a database that before I launch my coded UI tests, I've got a golden database with known data in there, and I know that every time I launch a test, it's going to look like this. Then I can get away with some weaker validations by making sure I'm using unique data and that sort of thing. So I definitely recommend that. If you're doing heavily data-driven type testing, I definitely recommend starting at a known good state every time. Hope that makes sense. All right, so then the final thing I want to show is multiple UI maps. And this gets a little more complicated, but there's still a lot of recording. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try and keep this fairly quick because I want to get to these other things. I want to create a new folder. So I'm going to add a new folder, call it my UI maps. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm kind of mentally, I'm going to break down this application into different pages. And I'm only going to store the control information for one page in one UI map. Okay, so each different page is going to get its own unique UI map. So to do that, I'm going to go add, and it's not on my shortcut list here, so I have to say add new item. And then up here in my test type in search, I want a coded UI test map. And let's call this the home page map. Okay, it's going to come up to the recorder, and now this I'm going to go ahead and try and record the launching of the browser this time. I may just never do that again. I won't. Okay, let's try this again. I'm not going to, if I don't launch the browser when the recorder's happening, I'm just going to, it's a demo fine. Okay, so let's start again. Edit with coded UI test builder. Okay, so recorder comes up. Assume I was already on the home page. Okay, now I can start doing my recording. So now I'm going to do the click the create new button. Generate to be, to get the demo moving along a little better here. I'm not going to be as granular with my generation as I was. So I'm gonna call this I did 3 actions within that. That's fine if you want to. If you're always doing the same thing, that's fine. Just got to record that. I messed up. I totally messed up. I was recording things on 2, 3 different pages and putting it in the single map. So let me reset a minute here. I'm going to just delete that all together. Okay, so the only controls I want to record are those that are on the home page, right? So all I really want to record here is the create new. Okay, and that's what else do I want to do on this page, right? So if I go back to dashboard, the other things I want to be doing is I want to be asserting things, right? And so this controls on the home page, so I'm going to add my assertion here. Okay, so I added an assertion, generate it. Okay, so I'm done with this page. And we go back to Visual Studio, and again, now we're just doing sort of a modular thing. So I've got a home page that contains, my home page map contains all the controls within my home page that I'm interacting with. I'm going to add another new map for my, let's call it the create ticket page. Okay, recorder comes up for me. So I'm only interested in recording things on this page, right? So I'm going to go, let's record. Okay, and you can imagine, so I'm going to go on and I'm going to record the description and the customer. And then I think one other thing worth noting here is now, notice when I record the create and generate, this time when I type in my click, I don't have a conflict with that other control that I tried to call the same thing. Something like click create button. I don't have a conflict because it's in its own map, its own little container. That's definitely nice. And generate that. Okay, now if I had more time, now I'm on the details page, so I'd add yet another UI map called details, and maybe it makes sense in here to go and do some assertions and validate some times or things like that, and then I'd record the back to list. And what that's going to look like in the finished product would be something like this. There we go. Okay, so if I take a look at my UI maps, now I've got a homepage UI map, I've got the new ticket UI map, I've got the ticket details UI map, and when I write code against that, I'm going to have to do things a little bit differently. And the keys here are going to have to be up in your using section. You're going to need to add a using to all the UI maps that you're interested in using. So the using coded UI test, UI maps.homepage, and new ticket and ticket detail are all right here. And then what I've done is created some private variables because I know that every test method within here is going to have to interact with those. So I've created some private variables, and I knew up those pages, those maps, when I start the testing. All right, now coding against that, I think, is a lot more comfortable now. So now if I go to my home map, and I look at the IntelliSense, I've got far fewer controls and things that I can interact with, right? So I can launch the browser. There should be some kind of a click create new, and there's the close. And so I've got far fewer things because I've created all these small little UI maps or small little buckets full of controls. So this is going to be a lot easier to interact with. All right, now if you've got multiple files here, you can easily understand how one QA person can be writing tests in one file and building out UI maps down here, and you're not going to collide into each other and have a bunch of different issues when you're trying to check things in. I don't think it's really necessary to show this running, but it looks exactly the same as if you had a single UI map. You can't tell the difference at all when you're running it. So I guess a little summary there is if you're willing to learn how to write a little bit more code here, but you're still more comfortable with recording most of your actions, you're going to be able to do a pretty good job of coded UI testing and doing multiple UI maps, as long as you're just willing to kind of dig in and learn just that little bit of code. Okay, and then one thing I wanted to show here, I want to actually get a failure, and I want to show you some cool, just one cool new API feature. So if anybody out there is already doing coded UI maps, these are two of the coolest new features in 2012. There's been some quite a number of enhancements made to the what's it called, the UI test control collection that makes validations much easier. And I think to demonstrate what those are, I'm just going to go and debug this, put a breakpoint and show you something. It does have to launch a browser, so okay, that went pretty quick, so good. Okay, I should have mentioned. So what's the code doing? Basically, it's launching the browser, navigating to Fabricom. Then I'm saying, go give me all controls that are of type hyperlink here. So give me all the hyperlinks, put them in a collection, control.find matching controls, right? And then here's the new stuff. You got this get names of controls, get values of controls, and get property value. Let's take a look at what those are. The hyperlinks, if I do a show source on the page, they don't have any names, but if there was a name attribute associated with a hyperlink, all we're doing is we're getting a string array of all of the name values. So now you can imagine writing an assertion that says, okay, I expect the hyperlinks to be named ABCD, whatever that is, put it in an expected value, and then compare the two arrays of strings together. So that's pretty cool. So get actual names, get actual values. So here's the values. So if I look at the FiberCam site, I've got a dashboard link, a ticket link, a customer link, so on and so forth. All these blue things over here are all links. So what I've done with that select logic is I've selected them all and populated a collection with what those values are. So now doing an assertion is really easy. I'm not one by one validating a link. I can validate all the links on a given page. So that should be a big time saver. And then finally, what I did here was what I wanted to do an assert on was the inner text property. And if we take a look at what that is, that's the text that's being displayed on the screen rather than the actual URL, right? So now I can go in and say, validate that it says dashboard and tickets and customers. And I purposely put a mistake in here, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to continue, and I'm going to get a failure. I'm not sure what happened here. This over here is the new Test Explorer. I'm very new to this too, and it's definitely off balance, and I'm not finding that my test even failed here, and I'm completely baffled as to why. Ah, here we are. I got a filter on. Whew. All right, get rid of that. Okay, so now we get this failed test here, and what I wanted to show you was if we look at the output, okay, it failed because, well, that's not the one. We'll go with it though. In any case, it failed because I was trying to record some title, but the actual value wasn't what it said. And here's what I wanted to show you. If you go into the qtagent32.config file and you turn on verbose logging, and I'll give you a link on some directions on how to do that. But if you turn on verbose logging, you'll get this UI action log as an output, and this is really useful for troubleshooting and trying to figure out timing. So basically, what I see here is I can see all the actions that were performed. I can see screen grabs of what was going on, and I can go in and I can even see what control was selected, how it was selected, and so this is going to be very helpful when you're trying to troubleshoot, especially performance type issues and that sort of thing. Really cool. Also cool if the QA person's doing the test, they don't know what the problem is, the coder can get a hold of this thing too. So this should be helpful to them. Having the screen grab right here. Click on that, it comes full size. See exactly what's going on. So those are two of the cooler new features within Coded UI Test. All right, I'm at least 15 minutes behind here, so I'm gonna move on from Coded UI. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is web performance testing. Web performance testing. The absolutely key thing to understand about web performance testing is that this works at the HTTP level. This isn't truly UI validation. And what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is the way the web performance test works is it sends an HTTP request to the server and it captures the response. Okay, and that's usually just HTML. So you can validate the HTML you get returned back to you, but there's no notion of ever rendering that HTML to make sure it looks correct or anything like that. So the best you can do is inspect the HTML and validate that various attributes are what they should be. Okay, so I think folks used to use web performance tests. They used to be called web tests. I think folks used to use them for automating UI testing on web applications, and that's okay, but it's not nearly as good, I don't think, as coded UI tests. So my recommendation moving forward is when you're doing UI testing, favor coded UI tests over web performance tests. Now, if you've got a bunch of web performance tests that exist already, and you're using them to do UI testing, that's fine. You can go ahead and keep doing that. It's not bad, but there's a few weaknesses in it. And so some of those weaknesses are that you're not actually testing the UI interaction. There's no JavaScript firing or anything like that. So if you make a request to the server responds with some HTML, JavaScript fires and it changes the HTML and adds some classes or styling or whatever it does, you're not going to be able to validate that. So that's one definite weakness. The other place you can't use the web performance test is in non-HTTP scenarios. If you've got a client server and they're not using HTTP to communicate, you can't use a web performance test. Only when you're doing HTTP. Okay, so it's good for really testing request-response pairs. That's kind of how I call it. It's really, in my opinion, more of a server-side test than it is the client side. They're exceptional as a part of a load test. They're for black box testing. Again, you don't need to have an intimate knowledge of what's going on with the code. They're also good for testing server response times. So if you want to write a bunch of web performance tests and automate them just to validate that your application isn't slowing down or going below some threshold, some service level agreement or something like that, they're good for that. They're also good for testing the old style ASMX web services. Okay. And then for the demo part, I'm going to bring the load testing into this as well. So load testing are good for web server load testing. So whether that's a web server or web services that you're testing, it's good for that. It's good for things like capacity testing. How many, I'm going to create a step pattern. I'm going to ramp up the users until I no longer meet my SLA. You can do that with the load testing. It's good for soak testing. If I run my application for 72 hours, am I losing memory? Things like that. Stress testing. If I run my site with 10% more than active users, am I going to be able to handle that? Or at what point am I going to break? And how am I going to break? It's good for that. Or spike testing. 8 a.m. in the morning when 500 users come and log on within 5 minutes. Can I handle that? All scenarios that are relatively easy to build up in the load test. When don't you use them? Again, non-HTTP scenarios. Okay, so I'm gonna shortchange this one in the demo. There's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot new. I'm just kind of going to give you a feel for what the workflow is with this and point out just a couple of things. Okay, so I'm going to create a new project, add a new project. Web and load test project. Click OK. Right click, add web performance test. And again, it comes up with a recorder here. So what do I want to do? This time it doesn't matter what shortcut I use at all because I'm not recording any of the interaction with the user interface. All I'm recording is HTTP, right? So I can click this shortcut. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do my, let's do my edit employee. Go in, click my employee, edit, zone 2. I'm going to say, yeah, zone 2. This is something I know is unique. And that's it. Okay, keep it simple. All right, so the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to rerun what was just recorded, Visual Studio. And the reason it's going to do that is it's trying to detect things, something called a dynamic parameter. And that's, for example, a session ID. If you're passing session ID, the web performance test needs to know that this is a dynamically generated ID and that it's going to have to capture it each time, right? So by rerunning it, it says, hey, I know last time session ID was 123. This time it's 456. I know that I need to treat this dynamic parameter differently. And that's all hidden for you, so you don't really have to worry too much about it. But it's fairly common it's somewhat common, I should say, to have to troubleshoot that once in a while. Okay, so what happened for me? The web test, it goes in, it created all of my, it captured all of my requests here, and then it figured out that I had to, I'm going to figure out anything interesting on these. ID, okay. So it figured out that I needed the ID on my last request here. I needed a form post parameter to send the ID of the address of the employee details that I just edited. So it automatically went in, created an extraction rule. It said, hey, there's this thing called hidden field 1. Extract that, put it in a context parameter so that I can use it in a future request. So it's doing all that stuff for me. And if you go through and run this, a couple of key things I just want to quickly point out. So if you go through and run this, down here, if things pass, they're going to be green. If things fail, they're going to be red. One of the more common things you'll see here is object move to here. All that is a response.redirect. So if you drill into the request, you're going to see where you were sent. Super critical to understand this. This web browser tab, it's not a full-blown browser. This is an approximation. No JavaScript is running. You'll never see ActiveX in here. You'll never see Silverlight in here, nothing like that. So you don't want to get too thrown if what you see in the web browser is not, the web browser window is not what you expect. You're going to, even though it looks funny, things may still be correct, okay? So you can, it's really helpful. You can dig into here and you can look at all the details of your request and what was sent back to you. Here's all my information. So this is, so that's really helpful for troubleshooting problems. Just to, let's say I want to go in and do a quick validation. Again, I recommend probably doing something like using coded UI rather than this. But if you want to, how would you go about doing that? I'm going to do a very simple validation. I'm going to say look for the task, look for the text, zone 2. And I'm going to ignore case because I don't remember how I cased it. Oh, there was zone 2. Actually, let's see. Let's make it fail. Just show you what it looks like when it fails. Look for the text zone 3. Rerun it. This time we get a failure. Details. Couldn't find zone 3. Right. So then I can go to my response. I can dig through here and say, oh, zone 3, I thought it was supposed to be in there. And I say, nope, there's zone 2. Okay, that's what I need it to be. Okay, so that's web performance test. And so doing validations is definitely not the sweet spot here. So I'm going to delete that one for my load test. But what is a good idea is to go through and say, okay, this request, I've promised my customer that they'll get this response within 2 seconds, 90% of the time, or whatever it is. So what is a good idea to go through on these requests is to go through and set response times where appropriate. So your key requests that you're really concerned about performance, go set your response times. Now, what I want to do, I'm going to save that. I'll hopefully be moving on to unit test in just 5 minutes here. Save that. Now I'm going to right click, and this time I'm going to add one more. Nope, I'm going to use a, okay. So I just went to the project that I pre-recorded when I was proving all this out. So now I've got 2 different web performance tests. One edits the zone for an employee and the other creates a new ticket, right? Now I want to create a load test. So I say add load test. All right, and this is kind of wizard driven, but to modify it, you don't necessarily have to use the wizard. There's just so many different properties and things to look through. I'd spend 2 hours if I was trying to explain everything available. So I'm going to go fairly quick, but it's just wizard driven. I'm going to create a load test. I'm going to call this my most common scenario. Think times are important. I was sitting here talking while I was recording the scenario where I changed that zone, and those timings were being recorded with me. So generally speaking, you want to use think times. Your normal human user interacting with your site obviously is going to need time to think. They're going to need time to read a paragraph, think about the answer, type it in. Normally you do want to use think times. I'm going to skip it this time. And normally all of your customers don't do it exactly 5 seconds here and 2 seconds there. So my opinion is the best setting here is use your think times distributed, excuse me, using the normal distribution. That's just going to make the test a little more realistic. So not every user staring at the screen just 5 seconds, then typing a word, then hitting enter. Okay, so this will get you a little more realistic load test. As far as load patterns here, I'm just going to do a constant user count of 2. Just I'll bring my machines to its knees if I do any kind of realistic load test. Here's where we hit the load chart. You can load pattern. You can either do a constant load, so 200, 2,000 users, or, and I do this very often, a step load. So I want to start with, I know my machine can handle 100 users. I want it every minute to add another 25 users, and I want to find where it breaks. And I know I'll never get to 10,000, for example. So it's really easy just to set up something that says, okay, hey, start me off with 100 and add 25 users every minute, and I'm just going to watch this thing and find out where it breaks. Then I know my capacity. So this is one of the most common types of load tests I do, common patterns I use on the load test. For now, we're just going to do a constant load. As far as test mix models, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to let you excuse me, read those descriptions, and they should make sense to you. Test mix, okay, which test do I want to include within here? Well, I'm only going to include the web performance tests. I can add unit tests. I recommend against it. I can add coded UI tests, whatever I want, okay? So really, here's what I've said. I said my most common pattern, I have people executing the editing of employee details, and I have people creating new tickets. Well, if I'm a crummy cable company, you know, I got a whole lot more people creating tickets than I do editing employee information, but maybe you got a lot of employee turnover or whatever. So maybe you're executing those frequently. So what I've done here is I've said, okay, 85% of the tests you execute during the load test should be creating new tickets, and only 15% should be editing zones. And typically you're going to have, you might have 5, 6, 7 key scenarios in here. Key different tests in here that make up your scenario. So that's kind of handy. Network. What kind of network do my customers use? Are they on 3G? Do I want to simulate a LAN? Do I want some portion, do I want to say 50% are on a LAN and 50% are on 3G? Whatever. So this is going to simulate different networks. Same with browsers. What are my folks using? IE, Chrome, Firefox. Simulate those browsers. So that's going to be sent in the HTTP request header. Okay. I could spend a ton of time on this. I'm just going to add my machine here because I'm both the web browser and I'm the client, but you're going to want to be monitoring your SQL Server database. You'll want to monitor your web servers or all the servers in your farm if you're using a farm. And that's this is where you go in and add those. And then there's some canned counter sets. So if this was the SQL Server, boom, I've just, with a click of the button, I've said, go grab me the most common SQL Server counters I'm going to be concerned about. Or if I'm running IIS or a .NET app or an ASP.NET app, just go grab those common counter sets. I think I'll just leave it as those two. Okay, and then I'm going to hit next. And then finally, how long do I want this thing to run? I'm only going to run it for a minute. We don't have much time here. Okay, but I can also do by test iterations. Run until you execute 1,000 tests or whatever it is. And then sampling rate. How often do I want to go out and grab those counters from the machine? Gloss over everything else. Click finish. And I didn't launch as an admin, so I think I'm not gonna get some counters. That's fine. So we go ahead and let's execute my load test. This is really tough on a smaller screen. What's going to come up though is all those counters and some key metrics that are gathered during load test are going to start showing up in the graphs up here. And I've got an error probably that it couldn't gather counters because I'm not running as admin. No, let's do this. I'm going to try one change here, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, I'll move on. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and move on past this. Maybe I've got a load test result open or something that. Okay, in any case, as you're running the load test, it's going to be showing various different graphs and counters and that sort of thing. Graphics here will be populating throughout the test run, so you can monitor. Let's see, see if I have any threshold. Yep, threshold violations will look like, let's see if I can find one. I can't find it on the graph, unfortunately, but well, this is strange. So it's throwing me an error, but I'm actually executing the test right now. Okay. All right, so for some reason, oh, this is a 10-minute test. So anyways, as I'm running along here, I can change which items I want to monitor. So the system under test is monitoring right now my server process memory, how many bytes per second, that sort of thing. If I stop my test, it's going to come up with a nice summary report. Where I can drill in and I can see, okay, here's my slowest pages up here. I can look down here and see what my average page times were. So it gives me some nice reports, nice graphics. I can create Excel reports, export these things to some canned Excel reports. So really some pretty nice capabilities here that just really don't demo well unless you've got a bigger screen. As far as new feature functionality, what's new with these web performance tests? I think there's a number of bug fixes, but I think the only new feature that I recall seeing is that there's now a 64-bit controller for better scaling. So if you're having problems with long test runs or hitting the larger virtual user counts, the 64-bit test controller should help. All right, let's leave the load test world. And get into the last couple of things here. Okay, so ordered testing. What is ordered testing? You use them when the order of your tests are important, and I don't recommend using them often, almost never if you can. You want to write your test in such a way that regardless of what order the test runner chooses to run them, they're going to pass. In the real world, I realize sometimes it's just too much of a burden to do that. When that's the case, use your ordered test. Generic testing too, that's just a legacy thing. That's a way of launching an executable, reading a response code, and giving you the ability to capture those results in Visual Studio or automated and publish them to TFS. The idea there is if you've got some old executable test harness that you want to include with your automated builds, the generic test is what you do. Okay, and this is just a command line thing. Unit testing. Okay, this is white box testing. This is where you need to have intimate knowledge of what's going on within the code you're testing. Unit testing is also good for WCF testing. WCF testing, unless you're doing the basic HTTP binding, you're going to need that client proxy. I'm forgetting the word, but I'll move on. So using unit test for this rather than web performance test is going to be a lot better for the WCF testing. It's also good for API testing, which maybe is more of a gray box testing, if you will, where maybe you know a little bit about the code, but you don't necessarily know exactly what's going on within the code behind it. So more of a maybe an integration testing type thing. Unit tests are also useful for that. And it's possible to do testing of HTTP responses within the unit test framework, but to me, why bother? I mean, I'm going to go with the coded UI test and probably even the web performance test over trying to do that with the unit type testing. Okay, we're also going to take a peek at the new fakes that are included with Visual Studio 2012. So stubs, mocks, shims, fakes, what do they all mean? And whatever site you go to is going to give you a different definition. I'm just going to use stubs, and I'm going to use shims the way that Microsoft uses them in their documentation. And a stub is basically replacement code that is executed. It's going to act as the actual class, whereas a shim is replacement code that is executed at runtime. The shim is going to be slower because at runtime it's going to be listening to a call to some external thing you don't have control over. And when it gets a call, it's going to insert the shim and execute the code that you tell it to. Okay? Whereas the stub, you're going to define the stub and pass it in via its interface into the test method. Okay, and we're gonna take a peek at those. All right, it looks like I'm going to go at least 10 or so minutes over. Brianna, are you cool with that, or do you want to mention something and then let me just keep talking for another 10 minutes? Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm going to start with, and I'm going to gloss over the very simple basics of unit testing. I suspect most people hopefully are doing it. If you're not doing it, it can be overwhelming to try and figure out where to start. My recommendation is this. Just start with always adding unit tests for all your new code and add unit tests for all bugs. It'll get you started. Okay, so what am I going to be testing here? I'm going to test just the simple person and address class. And for starters, I'm going to keep them really simple. So we've got some properties like first name, last name, age. Each person can have a list of addresses associated to them. We can add addresses, remove addresses, and I've got a couple of other Boolean properties. Is this person a minor? Are they retired? That sort of thing. Okay. Now, normally what I'd do at this part of the demonstration would be I'd right-click in here and I'd say generate unit tests, but that functionality is no longer in Visual Studio 2012. Not that big a deal to me. It really demoed nice, and it's only good kind of to basically get started. So not that big a deal. So rather than that, you're kind of stuck doing the old right-click. I'm going to add a project. It's going to be my unit test project. Name's not important. Click OK. And I'm going to right-click on my project. I'm going to add a new unit test. And boom, there, I'm ready to start testing. Okay? Now, at the speed of light, I'm able to type in some tests that I already had. And we'll just take a quick peek at some really simple unit testing. Okay, so the key here is that all of my test methods have to have the test method attribute. That's the key. You can ignore the test categories and the priorities and owners and that sort of thing for now. But as you're running unit tests and automating unit tests, these categories and priorities are useful if you want to, say, only run priority 1 unit tests on check-in and run all unit tests on my nightly build, something like that. So you can use categories and priorities for things like that. That's all I'm going to say on those. Okay, so simple unit test. We knew up a person, and what do I expect? I expect my first name to be null. Okay, very simple. Type of unit test. Or here I knew up a person, I give them an ID of 10, and I validate that when I run the test, it is in fact 10. The Test Explorer on here a little bit too. Okay, so hopefully let's do a new test method, just the full name. So if we were to jump back to my code real quick, the person code, you'll notice that I have a full name property that just concatenates the last name and the first name, right? So I want to write a simple test method to do that. So I'm going to add my test method attribute. My full name test. I'm going to get a new person. I'm going to set his first name and last. Define what I'm expecting from my test result, or I could just hard code it in there. And then I'm going to do an assert. Assert, put in my expected value and my target.full name. And I forget actually if the code was last name first or first name last, but let's just fire it off. I can run my test from here or the new test runner over here. Got a build error. Oh. Assert.r equal, run it. Had a failure. How come? Let's check the output. And because it was star comma Tim was my full name, right? Great, I got a bug I can fix that didn't get out to the field, right? Run my test again, just validate that it's working. All right, perfect. Simple. Now you might say, okay, clown, who writes classes that look like that? And the answer is pretty much nobody. So I want to throw a couple of slightly more complex scenarios at you. And the first one I want to talk about is the stub. What I've done here is I've created a new constructor on the person. And presumably this person I'm going to need to be able to load and create, update, and delete and that sort of thing. And I'm using a data store. Okay, so rather than newing up a data store within this class, I'm going to use something called dependency inversion, a technique called dependency inversion or constructor injection, where I'm going to inject the dependency of this iPersist via the constructor. So what I'm saying is when you build the person, you give me something that supports this iPersist interface. Let's just take a really quick peek at that guy. And it's simple. I've got create, read, update, and delete method. And how does that work? So given a create, I'm just passing in a list of string name value pairs, right? So I'm going to give you a generic list of string key value pairs. And then I'll create something and I'm going to return an integer. So as if the database is creating the idea there is that the database creates a unique ID, I'm going to return it to you. All right, similarly, read. This time though, you give me an ID and I'm going to return you a string list of what it is I read. Okay, you can read the rest to presumably make a decent amount of sense. Okay, so I want to inject this this data store or this iPersist thing in. So how am I going to handle that in my unit test? Well, the goal of the unit test is to test the smallest chunk of code possible, right? I want to focus on person logic. I don't want to have anything to do with the data store's logic right now. So what do? Well, what we do is we're going to add a stub. Okay, so if I go to my test project, I right click, and I'm going to say add reference, and I'm going to make it a reference to my solution. I'm going to add a reference to that interface right here. Right, so this is the project that contained my interface. Add a reference to that. And then what I'm also going to do is now if I dig into the references here, if I right click on the interface reference, now I can say add a fake assembly. All right, clean the solution. Okay, so if I right click on this, I say add a fake assembly. And notice two things. Under this fakes folder, we've added, and it's just a little XML file that says, hey, I've got this assembly called Fabricom Fiber Interfaces, this fake assembly. And then what it actually did up here is, I'm not positive what's happening behind the scenes, but I suspect the Visual Studio created an actual DLL for you and implemented actual code for you, and you can actually go into the object browser and take a peek at what it's done for you. Okay, well, I'll leave that to you to do. So now how do we use that? Well, the first thing we have to do, we want to come up here and we want to do, I have to do the using of the fakes. I'm going to have to add a using for the interface, right? My test class has to understand what that interface is. And I'm going to have to add the using for the Fabricam Fiber Interface fakes. Okay. All right. So now, again, with this sort of the magic of doing my homework ahead of time, I'll save a little time, uncomment some code. Now, how do you go about using that? Okay, so now when we new up a person, right here, we want to use the constructor where we pass in this data store. What data store are we going to pass in? Well, that magic code is right here. Okay, so I say that this iPersist store equals new Fabricam fiber, and then it's going to do a doc fakes, and then it the naming convention is stub, and then the interface name. Okay, so I'm newing up a class that implements that iPersist interface. And then what I'm doing here is I'm creating an implementation of a method. Okay, the method that I showed you on the interface, this gets a little bit confusing. See if I can shed a little light on that. Okay, so remember I've got my iPersist interface down here in the bottom pane. I'm trying to create an implementation of create. And then, so what is this business? Well, the naming convention for the generated code is for it to be the method name that you're implementing, followed by the type for the parameters. So create list of keys, value, pair of string is really get rid of the carets there, the comma, and the white spaces. That's your method name. So don't be thrown by that. I was a little thrown by that the first time. Okay, so the method accepts one parameter. I'm referring to it as ID. So if in here I wanted to return, ID plus 1, that would be perfectly reasonable. But I don't care. All I care about is that some ID is returned, right? I'm just going to hard code a 328. So I'm saying, show me that when I run this thing, a 328 is returned. It'd probably be worthwhile to go in now to our person class and look at the create method. Look at what the create method looks like, right? So the create method just creates a key value pair first with the first name as its value, last name as its value, and it calls the create method and sets the ID based on that. So super simple implementation, right? So back here on my fake, I've created a new implementation for the create. I said, no matter what, give me an ID of 328. and then set the first name, last name, call the create method, and then I'm going to check to see that they're equal. So when I run my unit test, person create test, passed. So it's all good. Okay, the last thing I want to do is talk about, so using a stub, that's appropriate for when you have nice interfaces defined, well-behaved things, but it's not appropriate for things like when you've got third-party dependencies or you're tied to somebody's code that decided not to use an interface or something like that. So that's when you've got to use the shim. Okay, so I've created, excuse me, I've created this assembly called fuzzy logic that's got a static method. So a static, you couldn't do a stub around either. It's got a static method called do fuzzy logic. Okay, and I'm trying to isolate my person class from that. And that was, what did I call that on? Okay, so I've got this mystery number method that when I call it, it calls fuzzy logic.do fuzzy logic. Okay, I didn't pass fuzzy logic or anything like that in. This is a hard dependency. Person is absolutely dependent on fuzzy logic, right? So how do I test person, specifically the mystery number, without going into this fuzzy logic code? And that's where I'm going to use a shim. Okay, so it's a similar process over here to use the shim. So I go to my test references. I'm going to add a reference. This time I'm going to have to browse for it, and I had to compile it. So I go out to my DLL, select it, hit OK. Third-party assembly, same thing. Right-click, add fakes assembly. It's generating code for me. I need to reference that stuff. I think that's all I need. Okay, and then, so now what my test code is going to look like, and this is just a little more gnarly, but not too bad once you get used to it. Now what my test method is going to look like is this. Let me get that out of the way so we can see it. Okay, so now my test method looks like this, and here's the key. To be able to run a shim, you're going to have to be in this new thing called a shim's context. Okay, and the pattern for doing that is to wrap your test code in this using statement. So using shim's context.create. Okay, and then it's got a similar naming convention in that I've got the do fuzzy logic was the method name. It took 2 parameters of type int32. So that's going to be the name of my method. And what I want to do is provide a different implementation of do fuzzy logic. Now, if you recall, what I did in the do fuzzy logic is I took a parameter, 1 and 2, added them together, and then added 3. So it's just strange. I just did something strange, right? And if I go to my person test, though, I'm just going to make it 987. And the reason I did this, I just want to prove that no matter what I send in, I'm going to get 987 back. And the test running framework right now, how it's going to pull that off is it's going to monitor for calls to the fuzzy logic.do fuzzy logic. It's going to intercept them and forward them through this thing, this shim. Okay, so that's the magic of isolating. That's how you can isolate your code from hard dependencies. You could do this with system.datetime. Add a reference to system. Fake it, and then every call to system.datetime.now, you could put a shim in there so it always returned leap day, the year 2000, whatever. Do that with anything. So pretty cool. Now, just to prove it's going to do what we're doing, if we right click, let's say debug, right? I knew up my person. I call the mystery number. This would have been 6 had I gone through the real assembly, but the result is actually 987. So I've successfully isolated person from a hard dependency called fuzzy logic. All right, with that, I'm going to give you just a minute as I close some windows. If you have some questions, now would be a great time to ask them, or I'm going to turn this back over to Brianna and end my little talk today. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Also want to mention that I've got some resources called out here for where to drill deeper into some of the things I talked about today, and some nice hands-on labs and that sort of thing. So that's the last slide in the slide deck. Thanks.